Karen and I grew up in little coal mining towns in southeast Ohio, down near West Virginia. And we never met as children, but we could both see the lights of a big earth mover called Big Muskie up in the hills. We realized later that we were both looking at this when we were kids off in the distance, this big earth-moving machine called Big Muskie. It was 6 stories tall and longer than a football field, and it was powered by a large extension cord. Believe it or not, it was actually plugged in. A single bite of its bucket could move 325 tons of earth. It was tearing Ohio apart for coal. And my father was a minister in a little white wooden Protestant church right next to the railroad tracks. And on Sunday mornings, the coal train would rumble through right during his sermon, and the hymnals would tremble in their racks on the backs of the pews. And he'd have to take a little break while the whistles blew and the train came through. And we had a blind piano player, and I used to watch him like a hungry man coming up on the Last Supper. I had some inkling as a boy that little wooden house, that piano with pedals like a car, and the sound coming out of it might have something to do with the story I would end up writing with my life. And I kept a good eye on the blind piano player. We'd go up the hill sometimes to visit him in his little house. It wasn't really much more than a shack, a leaning little house, and he'd be sitting in the corner cracking black walnuts to make a little extra money. And his fingers would be stained inky black from the walnut hulls, and he'd be listening to his record player. People had read books aloud for blind people on his records, and he'd be up there listening to scratchy literature. And on Wednesday nights, he'd come down, we had prayer meetings, and he'd play a few hymns, and then somebody would go to the front of the church with a little spiral-bound notebook and ask if anybody had any prayer requests. And our neighbors were getting ready to go on vacation. The father raised his hand and asked for prayer for traveling mercies. And my older brother's friend, Andy Androsco, raised his hand one time and asked for prayer for a particularly difficult algebra test that was coming up in the 11th grade. And every once in a while somebody would raise their hand and say, "I have an unspoken request." I was always so intrigued by that as a boy, the unspoken request. Was it something too scandalous to put into words, or did they just not have any words and needed a little help and needed to be with people that weren't afraid to admit that they needed help? Anyway, now when I sit down at the upright piano and let my mind wander and let my fingers wander around a little bit, I often think of it as an unspoken request of some kind. And we'll play a little instrumental before this next song, and you can provide your own words or not.
Bye.